den rechten.
Bir müşteri olan
Den rechten Teil an der Nordseite.
Şunu inceleyelim.
Moving forward.
Now we have 25 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, so that you can have a debate about these proposals, about these various scenarios also. I don't know if anyone here in the room would like to make a comment, respond, ask questions, offer alternative solutions. Now's the time to offer your ID box. Okay, I'm told in the earpiece that someone behind me wants to speak. On my left. Oh, sorry. I'm not deciding anything. Michel is talking in my earpiece and he decides. Claude Soulas. You talked twice yesterday. Yes, but that was yesterday. I have short questions. Well, be very short then. I'll try to be very short. I'd like to have to bring these presentations together, especially those by Juliette Mola and Frédéric Héran. We've talked about cost. Juliette Mola said that the paradox is that rail operators say, why have more urbanization around stations? Because it's very costly. When we tried to develop rail projects in Banville, we talked about intermodality in stations. So the paradox would be to think that currently regional trains are saturated because they're undersized, but now we promote park and ride facilities to bring people from further away. So now the cost problem is not for people who live nearby because the regional train is not that expensive. Maybe we could have peri-urban trams as is done in other countries. What is expensive is to have the cost of rail and then add on top the cost of park and rides. So maybe for a rail, you could transport people within a certain radius. Of course, you don't cover the whole territory with rail, but this is where Frédéric Héran's presentation is interesting. With bikes with a range of 5 to 10 kilometers around stations, this is something that may be more economical. But although sometimes in Switzerland you have peri-urban trams that are cheaper than regional trains, and so maybe with e-bikes or normal bikes that would be less expensive rather than having parks and rides that are fairly costly to try and attract people who will have to drive a number of kilometers before they even take the train. So the train is eco-friendly, but if you drive 20 kilometers to go and take the train, that's not that eco-friendly. Thanks for your short comment. Another question, Ludovic Bu, you spoke yesterday also. Only repeat offenders today. Yes, big mouse. I have a question regarding hypermarkets. Have you looked at the business model of hypermarkets in China? Well, in that case, that's an avenue for you. You have the answer, don't you? Well, I know about two cases, Carrefour and Auchan in Shanghai. I mean, that's not significant. It's only two examples. That's a change from Denmark, but 80% of customers walk or cycle to the hypermarket and they come every day. So there's a huge surface area. They are as big as in Europe, and the assortment is just as big. But people in Shanghai, there's Auchan, it's called Auchan even in Chinese, and there's a huge car park in front. There's a huge park in front of the hypermarket, but it's a bike park. And maybe you said that it would make sense to have houses near these huge hypermarkets, but these are the only two that I've seen in Shanghai. I don't know whether that's true for the whole of China. Now, can we draw general conclusions to say that this would be viable, not breaking the model and rebuilding something new? Maybe your online website can finance a study for Xavier Desjardins in Shanghai, because it's good to propose research, but it ought to be funded. Well, I think that his lab has got more funds than my online newspaper. Well, then you need to convince his lab director. Cécile Fer. I'm Cécile Ferré. I'm in charge of mobility studies for the Lyon Development Agency. I worked on mobility promotion as part of the PhD thesis. I wanted to talk about the extended public service for mobility that Jean-Pierre Orfeuille talked about. Right now, there are solidarity mechanisms that exist with mobility support, but this is not part of a public service. It's rather something that is a part of welfare aspect of mobility policies, and they cannot reach the most vulnerable populations. So here, I'm really calling for a public service for mobility. So 3 avenues for research. What do you think about those questions or comments? You've got your work cut out for 20 years now. Well, regarding parks and rides, in France there is no debate about that. Everyone believes that it's necessarily good. When you go abroad, you're very surprised. In Germany, in the UK, in Switzerland, in Belgium, there's a real debate about park and rides. People think that they're horribly costly, that it would be better to build houses and buildings instead of car parks. If you have multi-story car parks, they're very expensive, so the problem is the same. So that creates more problems than it solves. You'd probably have more traffic on a line if you build developments and shops around the station than if you build a park and ride to attract motorists. But in France, not only are we putting vast amount of money in park and rides, but we also make sure that those who drive pay less than those who walk or cycle. Even in a city like Strasbourg, if you live 100 meters away from a tram station, it's probably better to drive than walk there. If you're a full family, there are promotions that promote the use of cars right now. And second thing about shops. Mr. Bu. I'm from Strasbourg, so I'm explaining, says Mr. Bu. They're web journalists, I mean, very short attention span, questions left, right, and center. But what you need to observe is not the expenditure per visit, but the expenditure per time period per customer. If you think on those terms, everything changes. You realize that cyclists and pedestrians are more loyal than motorists, and they spend more per time period than motorists. And this is a finding that I came to in several countries in Europe and that I found in the French case in 2003. There's no doubt about that. And the last question was for Juliette Mola.
Yes, to respond to Claude Soulas's question about parks or park and rides. I mean, I think people are thinking about it in France as well. There is some degree of controversy, and local authorities say when they have a train station, if they build a parking lot there, you may have a situation where the parking lot is saturated, there are too many people riding the trains, and nearby residents will complain, and so while you may wish to have bigger parking spaces, the idea is good, but we haven't got the capacity to accommodate all these cars parked there and all these new car drivers that become trained passengers. And so it's all very well to optimize the network, but there are issues about this. Not everybody is happy with that. And also, it's all very well to have a parking lot next to a train station or a bus station. It all depends on where this train or this bus will take you. I mean, the station may be very good, but if it is not necessarily the case that people, even people living nearby the train station, may not be riding the train. It depends on where they need to go. So you have to combine all these things. It's all very well to make these train stations accessible, but also these train stations themselves have got to serve useful destinations, and so that involves lots of planning, and it's not just a matter of having a park and ride next to a bus or a train station. If there are other questions, this is your chance. You only have half an hour left, and then this will be the end of the discussion, because then we will give the floor to the final lecturer. My name is Olivier Dumont. I work for the newspaper Le Monde, and I have a question about the price of fuel. It is true that the price of fuel has come down over the past 30 years, or at least in nominal terms, no, not in nominal terms, but compared to the incomes of households. But then you say, well, hang on, people drive more, so they should, that bill, the fuel bill should increase because people use their cars more. Maybe the cars are more efficient. You said the price. What's the exact story? Can we? Well, it could be a complicated story because you have different periods since the first oil shock. But you have to remember what Yves Crozet said this morning. It's very true. Roughly past economic growth and what it has brought in terms of purchasing power, that growth has been greater than the increase in the price of fuel. So by working 1 hour, I can afford an additional liter of fuel every 10 years or something. Well, I don't know the numbers, but I mean, the ratio, the price of fuel relative to income has come down in relative terms. But it's already difficult to work it in constant terms. But what Yves Crozet said is looking at the 1990s and the first decade of the century, you have nominal prices going up, but the price, or at least the budget for fuel in the budget, or the portion of fuel in the budget has not increased very much. Well, it has increased maybe because people have grown richer and been able to spend more money on travel, etc. But well, now the growth has stagnated. But one thing is for sure: when you buy a car today, that car will consume half what it did 25 years ago in terms of fuel. I mean, people don't mention this, but and the French have realized this. So when you buy a car today, it is twice as efficient in terms of fuel, twice as fuel efficient as it was 25 years ago. And also the mobility system has become simpler. Basically, when you give a household an extra euro, that extra euro, what goes into housing, health, and new information technologies. That's basically where the money goes. In our own domestic budgets, we allow more and more money for cell phones and such like. And indeed, these machines are constantly being updated, renewed, and this means that well, some money is saved on fuel, and that that money saved on fuel is spent then on computers and whatnot. But it's true that if you read the papers, they talk about the increase in the price of in fuel prices. And they mention the fact that fuel prices have gone up, but they don't mention the fact that property prices have gone up considerably. Property prices have doubled over the past 10 years, and this has nothing to do with OPEC. Well, are you happy with that statement? Yes, I certainly am. Ma'am, Jean-Pierre Orfeuille, you are warned. My name is Madame Picard, and I teach at the School of Architecture, and I have a question about these shopping malls or shopping centers, or peri-urban shopping centers, more to the point, which we discussed just now. The question I had with in your explanation, I mean, the original shopping center I mean, it was designed to be visited by car for all sorts of reasons. And now, in the peri-urban context, you're looking at another type of consumption because the countryside is nearby, and now you can buy produce directly from the farm. So you don't need to go to the shopping mall. And of course, the context is that you get organic and better food, etc. So at the end of the day, you might ask, well, how can this happen? Direct sales from the farm. I mean, it used to be you could get your produce near a train station, sometimes in the vicinities of shopping centers, but maybe it should be back on the marketplace in the centers of these towns, a bit like these congenial spaces, these social places which you can walk to or cycle to. But of course, we talked about food. I mean, of course, food is one of the big budgets, and shopping for food carries not only a carbon footprint but also a health footprint. Yes, well, maybe you can give us this opinion about this in Montreal. Well, I would like to talk about our own park and rides. I mean, we have an urban plan which provides for a tighter network of train stations and people, well, looking at commuter trains, you have to see that they are being developed because at this stage more than half of the people drive to work and rather than taking a commuter train. But people say, well, look, you need parking space in any way, because if there's no parking space, whether you are looking at a train station or a shopping center, well, if the space is all used up, then there won't be enough customers, or at least the customers won't be coming anymore because they can't park, and so there's a real issue there. And of course, in these in the Peri centers, in the shopping centers, of course, this is car paradise. You have to drive there, and I mean, there's some public transportation, but by and large, people drive there. And so these big shopping centers are designed, and there's in fact no room for pedestrians. It's actually hazardous for pedestrians. The gentleman from Lancaster, I believe.
Hello, thanks. I am Javier Caletrillo. I am a research fellow at the Center for Mobilities Research in Lancaster. I just wanted to make two comments. The first one, we've been talking about France and Europe in general as if it was all middle class. There is a piece of research here in France that says that found that the top 5% of the population, those on the top, are responsible for more than 50% of the carbon emissions. And the second point I wanted to raise is oil. I disagree with what was said this morning about the price of oil staying more or less as it's been in the last few years. It is true that it went up in 2008 and then went down. But I'm now reading this book by John Urry. It's called Societies Beyond Oil. And there is a very nice paragraph. It says, if China carries on growing at the same rate, all the world oil exports will be consumed just by China in only 10 years. So this raises a huge geopolitical security and in environmental problems. Just wanted to make this comment.
Jean-Pierre Orfeuille, you are in a way concerned by these issues, aren't you? Well, what Yves said this morning, I mean, maybe he said this a bit quickly, but if you look at the 2000s, the price of fuel in terms of minimum wage hours has stabilized in France. Now, regarding what this gentleman has just said from Lancaster. Everybody has these worries or fantasies about China. You have twice as many electric bicycles in China as there are cars, as things stand today. The second point is what you're saying is true if you take a sort of a long view. However, if you look at where China is coming from, even if you multiply its activity by 2 or 3, this is not going to upset the oil market. What Jean-Marie has just said may be true in 2060, but not in 10 years' time. The question I had was saying, if you look at existing distributions of commercial property, retail spaces, and residential property, is it still possible geographically to use the bicycle? It is, in fact, possible in geographical terms. And the reason why you do not build these cycle paths, etc., is that the people, the main people concerned, do not have a voice, do not have a say, and urban architects, urban planners have paid little attention to this. They use the land for other uses. So that's the first thing. I mean, it is geographically possible, but you still need to provide some sort of infrastructure to make it possible. And it is true that there will be changes, not just in these networks, road networks, but also there are other cases. I mean, you can, instead of going to the supermarket to do your shopping, you might buy produce fresh from the farm. But there's one huge trend that's emerging, and that's online shopping. That is much more than anecdotal. Yeah, well, there's another thing which will adapt to all sorts of shocks, environmental shocks and whatnot. If you look at the retail industry is highly flexible, highly adaptable. It has always been. So if it is more advantageous to have a larger number of smaller markets closer to the customers, the retail industry will do it immediately, and these big shopping malls will be abandoned. Some of them are already being abandoned because people, instead of driving for miles and miles, prefer to have a nearby convenience stores, and these shopping malls will be converted to something else. They will be reduced in size. I was going to say you're going to be reduced to ashes. No, they can be transformed, or that's not the issue. It's much easier. I mean, you can certainly relocate the retail industry, but the jobs are more difficult to relocate. Housing is more difficult to move about, because if you want to move or change houses, every time there are high expenses, and maybe some of the taxes could be made more incentive. And, so, my name is Jean-Jacques. I come from Cameroon. And it was said that there's no such thing as a peri-urban world. There are peri-urban worlds in the plural. It was said that inhabitants of the French peri-urban world have a rather urban lifestyle. But if you look at the situation in Cameroon, people in Cameroon are closer to the rural world. And I have a concern for Jean-Pierre. Can you still, is there still such a thing as a peri-urban world in this case, or is it rather not a peri-rural world? Well, you can always invent words, but you do not seem... No, the language is very much alive, and you can certainly invent words and concepts, but I mean, you need to have the appropriate definitions. You can call things like what you want. Well, thank you so very much, and this will be the final word of this session. A round of applause to thank all the speakers.
Den Rechten.